August 12, 1944. A ruined French highway outside Rouen. The German High Command, maps folded and cigars ash falling on polished mahogany, read a simple arithmetic that seemed to settle the fate of any deep-pocketed advance. Fuel and ammunition would run out long before the American armored spearheads could reach Paris. The calculation was ruthless and convincing. An armored corps burned through thousands of gallons every day, and the nearest depots were hundreds of miles to the west. On paper, the offensive would stall. On the road, a line of headlights became a new kind of geography. Night after night, a river of trucks flowed eastward, engines clattering like a new kind of artillery. At the center of that engine noise was a decision made by a group of logistical officers who refused to translate doctrine into inevitability. Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Carrington of the 6th Motor Transport Group stood in a cold, tent-lit map room and argued for what looked like waste in industrial scale. The Red Ball Express was not a bridge of steel, but a promise of volume over thrift, of continuous movement over economy, and of redundancy over perfection. This story will show how that promise, argued in whispers and shouted across dusty fields, forced German generals to revise a calculus they had believed immutable. It will reveal the human cost and the technical choices that transformed a theory of war into a flowing operation that changed the speed of the entire front. It will show how drivers under moonless skies became the most decisive resource in a campaign that the enemy had written off as impossible to sustain. The assumption that logistics was merely a background service was a doctrine with deep historical roots. Armies had won or lost because of supply lines since antiquity, and the 20th century had carved that truth into manuals and lecture hall problems. German doctrine in 1944 insisted on efficiency, fuel consumption, and the avoidance of waste as bedrock principles of operational art. Planners pointed to campaigns where a shortage of parts or a broken bridge had stopped mechanized units in their tracks. They cited precedent and numbers. In staff colleges, an advance without secure depots had always been a gamble. The American approach after Normandy looked reckless. The Allies had prioritized speed and combat power over fixed infrastructure. Paradoxically, that audacity had been enabled by an industrial economy of unprecedented scale. Where German armies relied on railheads and carefully scheduled convoys that mirrored doctrine, the American forces could consider volume as a tactical choice. That strategic shift was not merely quantitative, it was cultural. In staff rooms filled with tobacco smoke, German officers spoke of scarcity as inevitability. American logisticians, veterans of a peacetime economy reorganized for mass production, thought in streams. They imagined filling the gaps with trucks and men and improvisation. The contrast showed in small things. At a German Corps headquarters, a waiter set down coffee with the clink of china, and talk turned to fuel curves and depot distances as if those graphs were the weather. At an American motor pool, the smell of grease and warm oil mixed with the sound of radios tuning, and men argued about spare parts as if the conversation could itself summon engines. For the German generals, the math closed the book on offensive depth. For the Americans, the math became a challenge. The numbers that justified pessimism were stark and simple. A medium armored division consumed tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline and thousands of rounds of artillery ammo per day when advancing. If the front moved more than a few dozen miles from established railheads, the daily tonnage requirement ballooned beyond the capacity of existing depots. Intelligence reports calculated the gap in a manner that seemed conclusive. The front needed, by conservative count, some 20,000 tons of supplies a day to maintain an operation of breakout scale. Rail capacity, road quality, and bridge availability constrained throughput. A single destroyed bridge could cut tonnage delivered by half for days. German staff officers ran regression after regression and arrived at a prediction of collapse without new depots or rail repairs. They believed that fuel consumption would outstrip truck delivery capacity and that the American armored advance would be forced onto a schedule the Germans could anticipate and exploit. Maps with colored pencil lines marked the limits of sustainable advance. At that moment, the mathematics seemed less like an argument and more like a verdict. Yet those same numbers contained hinges for contrarian interpretation. If the constraint was depot distance, then imagine pushing consumption closer to the front. If the limit was bridge capacity, then think of rerouting and of continuous repairs. If the bottleneck was vehicle availability, then accept losses as the cost of maintaining flow. Those were not elegant equations. They were operational philosophies. The German reading favored preservation and economy. The alternative favored volume and redundancy. The first forecast declared a stall. The second proposed a machine of trucks. The conception of the Red Ball Express emerged in a small tent with a single map table and a handful of officers who refused the comfortable clarity of the pessimistic arithmetic. Colonel Paul W. Forsyth and Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Carrington were not mythic heroes. They were logisticians used to schedules and to late-night phone calls. The plan they proposed was radical only in its insistence on continuous movement. It demanded a dedicated network of routes exclusively for supply traffic prioritized by time and by purpose. The rules were simple and unforgiving. Trucks would move on round-the-clock schedules in alternating shifts. Routes would be labeled red ball to indicate priority, and no cargo would stop unless it was to resupply or for emergency repairs. Drivers would accept the wreckage of roads and the inevitability of losses as part of the cost. Depots would be set up forward as temporary dumping grounds with minimal paperwork. Maintenance would be mobile and relentless. Fuel would be staged in thousands of drums and put into service with pumps loaded onto trucks. The plan was a list of trade-offs presented in 3 pages of staggering simplicity. It was logistics in motion rather than logistics as infrastructure. The idea appealed to a certain kind of officer who had faith in repetition and in mass. It scandalized peacetime planners who thought of procurement cycles and accountability. At the first briefing, major staff officers argued about each clause as if the language itself could preserve doctrine. Major Henry Strauss asked how losses would be tolerated. Captain Eleanor Brooks, the supply operations chief, answered with a calculation that made generals frown. She insisted on redundancy and on mass production of trucks as the hedge against predicted attrition. The plan had rules and limits, but its core was cultural. It equated speed of supply with the tempo of war. Where doctrine said that an army without secure rails would slow, the Red Ball approach said that an army with supply trucks on Red Ball routes would accelerate. Putting that conception onto the road required a cultural change more than it required new equipment. The American force had trucks old and new, drivers from diverse backgrounds, and mechanics who had learned improvisation out of necessity. The Red Ball Express recruited from motor transport units, and its composition reflected the inequalities and urgencies of the era. Many drivers were African American soldiers assigned to transport units because segregation policies excluded them from many combat roles. Names like James Hall, Thomas Jenkins, Miguel Rivera, Lewis Carter, and Samuel Owens became associated with the convoy. A handful of women, like Captain Eleanor Brooks and Lieutenant Mary Franklin, operated dispatch and supply nodes. Mechanics such as Oscar Delgado and Henry Kim jacked up engines on mud-choked roads and welded exhaust pipes from scrap. Each route produced habits. Drivers learned to read the road at night by the way the charge lights flickered and by the smell of burned oil mixed with earth. Dispatchers tracked shifts and balanced risk with availability of spare tires and fuel drums. Depots were improvised from barns and ruined warehouses where the sound of idling motors and the clatter of boxes created a new frontier of industry. In those early days, improvisation came to mean survival. Drivers slept in cabs and cleaned hands with cold water because soap would be rationed. The culture of continuous movement valued throughput over maintenance perfection. The message was clear in the trucker's own words. Sergeant James Hall once wrote in his diary that the road felt like a drumbeat that would not be silenced. Private Miguel Rivera recalled the taste of diesel on his lips from pumping fuel and the vibration of a loaded truck as a kind of lullaby. Those images of touch and smell and sound brought ordinary men and women into a logistical experiment. The tactical innovations that underpinned the Red Ball Express were precise and often brutally pragmatic. Maintenance. Instead of returning disabled vehicles to rear workshops, mechanics created mobile maintenance teams that followed the convoys. Each mobile team carried essential spares and a brazing torch with which they reshaped radiator hoses in the field. Fuel management prioritized redundancy. Fuel was pre-staged in drums at forward dumps and in small collapsible tanks that could be set up by 2 men in under an hour. Pumps were mounted on trucks and on makeshift stands so that refueling could be done at night by blackout and by rote. Route discipline was enforced by color coding and by time windows. Red ball corridors were for supply only and were patrolled to keep civilian traffic off the road. The throughput calculation ignored neat accounting systems in favor of simple tonnage delivered per day. The principle became volume over efficiency. By manufacturing spare parts and tires in mass production, the Army accepted the attrition of material as a predictable expense. Engineers installed temporary bridging and chose redundancy over the single point of failure. When bridges were destroyed, alternate ferries and bypasses were improvised. The operations required constant communication between depots, dispatch, and frontline units. Radio operators like Lieutenant Mary Franklin became the nervous system of the supply chain. Their voice reports smoothed bottlenecks and shifted priorities from artillery ammo to fuel to food, depending on the immediate consumption curves. Those process changes were small in isolation, but enormous in aggregate. They changed the availability of supplies more quickly than any repair to the rail network could. Tension built as the German High Command recognized a phenomenon it had discounted. At first, German reports called the convoys a curiosity. Then they noted tonnage numbers that did not match expectations. Intercepts and aerial photographs revealed long lines of trucks on nights when the Allies were supposed to be conserving materiel. General Erich Stahl and Field Marshal Victor Marin convened staff conferences, and the tone shifted from bemused to alarmed. Prisoners captured at the front told the Germans that Allied tanks were moving faster and with more fuel than intelligence had predicted. Morale at the German command post suffered as men who trusted the old equations found their models failing. There were moments that condensed anxiety into single images. One image was of a frontline observation post where a German staff officer looked through binoculars and saw headlamps advancing in a steady, unblinking pace like a lantern chain across the hills. Another image showed intercepted dispatches detailing the weight of tonnage moved in a single night. Those numbers contradicted doctrine and caused a crisis of imagination. The Germans had learned to fight a particular logistical style, and now faced an opponent making logistics a mobile weapon. Their reaction involved reallocating units to attack supply lines and to mount air sorties against convoys. Yet the American method included redundancy and speed as defense. Convoys were organized in such a way that a lost column could be replaced by a follow-up in hours rather than days. The psychological effect on German troops was clear. Reports from captured soldiers mentioned a kind of astonishment. They had expected to meet exhausted units and instead confronted armored columns with full fuel tanks and fresh ammunition. That mental shock shifted the tempo of German decisions and raised the stakes of every counterattack. The climax of the operation was not a single battle, but the accumulation of uninterrupted movement and the tactical reversals it enabled. Over weeks, the Red Ball Express delivered tens of thousands of tons of supply, pushing the front line forward at a rate that German generals had not predicted. The convoy system had grown into an engine with its own logic. Drivers ran 2 shifts and sometimes 3 when the demand spiked, and the sound of engines became the soundtrack to advance. There were scenes of raw human courage and of tragic loss. In a rain-soaked valley, a bridge collapse swallowed a truck and 2 drivers. Their colleagues pulled them from the wreckage with hands smeared in oil and mud and carried on. In another moment, a German air raid fragmented a convoy and scattered boxes of ammunition across a farm field where children later picked through discarded packaging for usable metal. The cost was counted in vehicles lost and in men injured. But the tempo that the Red Ball Express created could not be ignored. Units that the Germans expected to face withering attrition arrived with supplies and took positions before the enemy could recalibrate. Prisoners taken on the eve of Paris liberation later testified that American armored units had come with a logistical tale they had misread. Supplies allowed commanders to push their advantage and to exploit gaps in German lines. The psychological effect of constant resupply was as decisive as the tonnage itself. German units faced not a momentary sting, but an ongoing pressure. They saw trucks at night and understood that every truck carried more than fuel and ammo. Each truck carried the capacity to extend an operation by days that the enemy had not planned for. In that steady pressure, the doctrine that equated preservation began to fray. There were moments of tension I should name in close detail because they shaped decisions in ways which numbers alone cannot show. One night, the convoy hit a stretch of road where British engineers had attempted a repair that collapsed under the weight of a loaded tanker. Drivers gathered in the rain, muffled in canvas and mud, and argued over the only available detour. Tired hands fumbled with ropes and jacks, and the air smelled of gasoline and wet wool. After an hour, a makeshift diversion opened and the column moved on, but the delay cost hours of delivery and forced commanders to reroute critical munitions. That night, commanders at a forward depot recalculated and redistributed supplies to prioritize fuel over food. In another tense episode, a German reconnaissance unit penetrated a supply dump at dawn and set fire to thousands of cartons. Flames licked the warehouses and men fell silent and watched their work burn. Captain Eleanor Brooks organized men to salvage what they could and reroute the remaining goods. Her quick decisions averted a strategic shortfall and preserved an armored division from stalling. A third moment came when a single bridge blown by retreating engineers left a direct line severed. For 48 hours, convoys backed up and tension rose at command posts. Engineers and truckers worked around the clock to build a temporary pontoon, and when the first loaded trucks crossed the makeshift bridge, the relief was almost audible as a collective exhale. Each of these moments was a concentration of sensory detail: the taste of burned wood, the sting of rain, and the sound of shouted orders. They were tactical crucibles where improvisation met doctrine and where the Army learned to accept loss as a cost to be managed rather than a catastrophe that would halt the campaign. The human dimension of the Red Ball Express is often summarized by statistics but lived by names. Drivers like James Hall and Thomas Jenkins drove long hours, often at night with lights blacked out and the constant fear of ambush. Many of these men were young and found in the convoy a livelihood and a sense of purpose. Mechanic Lewis Carter slept under the chassis of trucks and replaced pistons by candlelight. Dispatchers such as Lieutenant Mary Franklin read voice reports into crackling radios and felt responsibility like a physical weight. Each person carried a backstory that fed the operation. Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Carrington had served in logistics since before the war. His backstory included a childhood in a Midwestern town where his father ran a garage and taught him that nothing in mechanics or management matched persistence. He had studied mechanical engineering and entered the service with a pragmatic bent. Before joining the Express, he had overseen supply coordination for amphibious landings and had a reputation for patience with paperwork and for a short temper with delay. His belief in simple rules came from watching small-scale improvisations that scaled under stress. He remembered one early episode in which a single spare tire had kept a battalion on the road and concluded that redundancies mattered more than neat inventories. That backstory shows why he favored mass production and repetitive processes. He trusted drivers more than diagrams because he knew that in the end, it was human hands that would bridge the gaps between maps and reality. The Red Ball Express did not exist in isolation. It provoked reactions and adaptations on both sides. German forces attempted interdiction operations and used air attacks to harass convoys. Allied air defenses and route discipline reduced vulnerability but never eliminated losses. At the diplomatic and industrial levels, the operation accelerated changes. Factories in the United States increased production of trucks, tires, and spare parts. The steel and rubber industries responded to the demand, and the concept of producing as many spare parts as necessary became a wartime norm. The operation also revealed social fissures at home and in the Army. The prominence of African American drivers in the Red Ball Express highlighted inequalities and also opened slow doors to greater recognition and later integration in the armed forces. Newspapers and photographs captured long lines of trucks and faces behind windscreen glass, and those images helped shape public understanding of the scale of war work. Studies after the war cited the Red Ball Express as an example of logistics forcing strategy rather than the reverse. Commanders learned that controlling supply flow controlled tempo. The operation became a case study in logistics manuals for decades. As the front pushed closer to Paris, the German predictions of collapse looked increasingly wrong. The Red Ball Express had a concrete measure. In the span of 2 months, the convoys delivered hundreds of thousands of tons of material and moved supplies east faster than rail repairs could have allowed. That tonnage came at a cost. Thousands of vehicles were lost to accident and enemy action, and hundreds of drivers and mechanics were killed or wounded. Still, the net operational effect was a shortening of the campaign by weeks in the estimation of Allied planners. German generals who had expected to see battered units unable to advance found troops arriving with full gasoline cans and belts of ammunition. Their counterattacks were blunted not merely by firepower, but by the surprising endurance of Allied logistics. That endurance had an analytic explanation. Redundancy created resilience. Mobile maintenance reduced downtime, and mass-produced spares replaced what could not be repaired. Temporary depots brought tonnage closer to users. Those mechanics and truckers created a moving supply chain resilient to the traditional shocks of war. 1 month after the operation began, the physical landscape showed scarred roads and small impromptu depots where the clatter of loading echoed in ruined towns. The immediate effect in the first month was acceleration. Frontline units advanced despite damaged rails because the convoys kept wheels turning. Commanders learned to plan offensives with less fear of overextension because supply could be routed and rerouted to meet emerging needs. The mood among drivers was weary but resolute. 3 months in, the intensity of the operation became a strategic norm. Factories adapted and production rates of trucks and spare parts increased. The demand for replacements normalized attrition as a predictable expense, and planners shifted from trying to prevent loss to ensuring sufficient replacement streams. 6 months after the Express first rolled, the lessons had migrated into doctrine. Logistics was no longer background service. Armies began to write supply flow into operations planning as a weapon. Post-war studies recorded that the Express had changed not just that campaign, but the language of mobile logistics. Veterans of the Express parlayed their experience into civilian life, building trucking firms and participating in post-war reconstruction projects. Their work influenced road design and transport policy in peacetime, and sometimes altered national economies by accelerating the adoption of highways and commercial logistics practices. The human cost remained visible in cemeteries and in the quiet stories families told at kitchen tables about men who spent nights on unlit roads. At the end, it is useful to put final numbers in a perspective that measures scale and consequence. The Red Ball Express moved hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies in the months after Normandy and maintained an average throughput that German intelligence had thought impossible. The operation required thousands of trucks operating in shifts and depended on an improvised maintenance culture and a mass production apparatus back in the United States. The cost in material was high and the human toll was real. But the strategic outcome was unambiguous to those who studied it after the fact. The initiative forced German commanders to fight for a problem they had not expected to face, a logistical tempo that denied them the pause they needed to consolidate. The operation taught that logistics could be a decisive offensive tool and not merely an administrative concern. If you are surprised by these numbers, you are not alone. It is difficult to imagine that a flow of trucks could decide in advance, yet that is what happened. Which decision in this story do you find most surprising? Write a one-sentence comment starting with, "The choice that surprised me most was," and tell us why. Your comments help others see different angles and will inform future episodes where we break down the human mechanics behind strategy. Now let us return to the road and see how individual choices at the roadside scaled into strategic consequence. History would remember the Red Ball Express as a paradox. It was both improvisation and system. It accepted waste as a price for momentum and proved that relentless supply flow could substitute for fragile infrastructure. The commanders who had underestimated American logistics learned to distrust comfortable arithmetic and to pay attention to the reality of engines and hands and roads. The legacy was both institutional and personal. Institutional because armies incorporated redundancy, mobile maintenance, and the idea of supply as a tempo setter into their doctrines. Personal because men and women who had driven and repaired and dispatched in the middle of night returned to civilian life with skills that helped build highways, warehouses, and transport companies. The final image lingers. A long column of trucks at dawn, their lights dimming as the sun rose, and the drivers rubbing sleep from their eyes and smiling at a job that had to be done. The cost was counted in lost vehicles and in grieving families. The reward was measured in liberated towns and in months removed from war. The Red Ball Express did not win the war by itself, but it changed the arithmetic of movement, and in doing so, altered the options available to commanders and the course of operations. If this story moved you, consider subscribing and leaving a comment with the decision that surprised you most. The rumble of those trucks is still a lesson in how logistics can become strategy.